I was knee-deep in mud when I realized the HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their fiscal year. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier, stamped with that familiar pretentious logo of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association, demanding that I personally maintain the drainage ditches running along the back boundary of my property in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Not just clean them out once, mind you, but maintain them indefinitely as part of my property responsibilities. The thing was, those ditches weren't on my property at all. My name is Marcus Webb, and I had been living in this modest 3-bedroom ranch house on Willow Creek Drive for almost 7 years. I worked as a civil engineer for the county, which meant I knew more about property lines, drainage systems, and municipal infrastructure than most people forgot after high school geometry. When I bought the house back in 2019, I had done my due diligence. I had surveyed every inch of my lot, reviewed the plat maps, checked the easements, and made absolutely certain I knew where my property ended and where the common areas began. The drainage ditches in question were part of a stormwater management system that served the entire neighborhood. They ran behind approximately 40 houses, including mine, collecting runoff from the streets and yards before channeling it into a detention pond near the neighborhood entrance. According to the county records, the original developer had deeded these ditches to the HOA as common property, making them the HOA's responsibility to maintain. Not mine, not any individual homeowners, the HOA's. I read the letter again that evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a beer and a growing sense of disbelief. The signature at the bottom belonged to Patricia Drummond, the HOA president, a woman who had made it her personal mission to find violations in every yard, every mailbox, and apparently now every drainage system in the neighborhood. Patricia was exactly what you would picture when someone said the words HOA president. She was 53 years old, drove a white Lexus SUV that was always suspiciously clean, and had that particular haircut that suburban women get when they ask to speak to the manager so often that they just decide to become the manager. The letter stated that I had neglected the drainage ditches behind my property, allowing them to become overgrown with vegetation and debris, which allegedly caused potential flooding hazards for the community. It demanded that I clear, clean, and maintain these ditches within 30 days, or face fines of $100 per day until compliance was achieved. The letter concluded with a reminder that maintaining common areas adjacent to my property was my responsibility as outlined in the HOA covenants. Except, it wasn't. I pulled out my closing documents that night and spent 2 hours reviewing every single page. The covenants were clear. Homeowners were responsible for their lawns, their structures, their driveways, and any landscaping within their property boundaries. Common areas, which explicitly included drainage systems, retention ponds, and green spaces, were the HOA's responsibility. The HOA collected monthly dues of $75 from each of the 212 homes in Riverside Meadows, specifically to maintain these common areas. I did the math quickly. That was $15,900 per month, or roughly $190,000 per year, collected specifically for common area maintenance. And yet, looking out my back window at the ditches in question, I could see they hadn't been properly maintained in at least 2 years. Tall grass, cattails, and small shrubs had taken root along the banks. Fallen branches and accumulated sediment had reduced the water flow capacity by at least 30%. The next morning, I called the HOA management company. I got a receptionist named Deborah, who sounded like she had answered this exact type of complaint about 1,000 times before. "Riverside Meadows, HOA, how can I help you?" she droned. "Hi, this is Marcus Webb on Willow Creek Drive. I received a letter from Patricia Drummond about maintaining drainage ditches, but I believe there's been an error. Those ditches are common property, not my responsibility. Please hold." The hold music was a tinny instrumental version of a song I couldn't quite place. After 4 minutes, Deborah came back. "Mr. Webb, I'm showing that you were sent a notice regarding covenant violations. Is there something specific you're disputing?" "Yes, the entire premise of the letter. The ditches are not on my property. They're HOA, common property according to the plat map and the covenants. I'll make a note of your concern and have Mrs. Drummond contact you. When can I expect that call?" within 5 business days. This seems pretty urgent given the 30-day timeline in the letter. I'll make a note that it's urgent. The call ended, and I had the distinct feeling that absolutely nothing would happen. I was right. 5 business days came and went with no call from Patricia. On the 6th day, I received a second letter. This one was even more aggressive. It stated that I had failed to acknowledge the first notice and that my continued negligence was now being documented for legal action. The daily fine would increase to $150 if I didn't begin work within 2 weeks. I decided to take a different approach. That Saturday morning, I drove to the county assessor's office in downtown Cedar Rapids. The building was one of those utilitarian concrete structures from the 1970s that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought beauty was a waste of taxpayer money. Inside, I found the Public Records Department and requested the plat map for Riverside Meadows, the original development agreement, and any recorded easements. The clerk, a patient man in his 60s named Harold, brought me 3 large document boxes and a microfilm reader that probably predated the internet. "Looking for something specific?" he asked. "Property line dispute with my HOA." Harold chuckled. "You're the 3rd person this month with that exact problem. Good luck." I spent 4 hours in that office, reviewing documents, taking photos with my phone, and making notes. What I found was even better than I had hoped. Not only were the drainage ditches clearly designated as HOA common property, but there was also a specific clause in the development agreement that made the HOA legally responsible for maintaining them to county stormwater management standards. Failure to do so could result in the county taking over the maintenance and billing the HOA for the costs plus a 20% administrative fee. Even more interesting, I found the original maintenance plan that the developer had submitted to the county. It specified that the ditches should be inspected quarterly, cleared of debris semi-annually, and have vegetation management performed annually. According to the photos I had taken of the actual ditches, none of this had been done in years. I documented everything, then went home and drafted a detailed response letter to Patricia Drummond. I cited the specific covenant sections, attached copies of the plat map with the common property clearly highlighted, included excerpts from the development agreement, and politely but firmly explained that I would not be maintaining property that wasn't mine. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. 3 days later, Patricia showed up at my door. It was a Tuesday evening, just after 6. I had gotten home from work about 20 minutes earlier and was still in my work clothes when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Patricia standing on my porch, wearing white capri pants, a turquoise blouse, and an expression that suggested she had just discovered something offensive in her refrigerator. "Mr. Webb, we need to talk about your attitude problem," she said, not even bothering with a greeting. "Hello, Patricia. What can I do for you?" "You can start by showing some respect for the community standards we've all agreed to uphold. Your refusal to maintain the drainage area behind your property is creating a hazard for everyone. As I explained in my letter, those aren't on my property. They're HOA common property, which makes them your responsibility, not mine." Patricia's face flushed slightly. "That's not how it works. Every homeowner is responsible for maintaining the areas adjacent to their property. It's common sense." "It's actually not common sense or legally accurate. I've reviewed the covenants, the plat map, and the development agreement. The ditches are explicitly designated as common property. The HOA collects dues specifically to maintain them. I don't care what some old documents say. The board has decided that homeowners need to take more responsibility for the community." This was the moment I realized Patricia wasn't confused or mistaken. She was deliberately trying to shift the HOA's responsibilities onto individual homeowners to avoid spending the dues money actually collected for that purpose. "Where is the dues money going, Patricia?" I asked directly. "That's not your concern." "Actually, as a dues-paying member of this HOA, it absolutely is my concern. We pay nearly $200,000 a year in dues. If that's not being used to maintain common property, I'd like to know what it is being used for." Patricia's expression hardened. "You have 2 weeks to begin clearing those ditches or the fines start, and I'll be recommending to the board that we pursue legal action against you for your continued obstruction." She turned and walked back to her Lexus, leaving me standing in my doorway, equal parts angry and amazed at her audacity. I went inside and immediately started drafting another document. This time, it wasn't a letter. It was an invoice. Over the next week, I put together the most detailed professional invoice I had ever created. I used my engineering expertise to calculate exactly what it would cost to properly maintain those drainage ditches according to county standards and the original development plan. I broke it down into categories: initial clearing and debris removal, vegetation management, erosion control, sediment removal, equipment rental, labor costs, and engineering oversight. For the initial clearing alone, I calculated it would require approximately 40 hours of work with specialized equipment. Renting a small excavator would cost around $800 for the weekend. A brush cutter would be another $150. Debris removal and hauling would require a dump truck, another $300. Labor, which I valued at $75 per hour based on my engineering rate, came to $3,000 just for the initial clearing. Then there was the ongoing maintenance. Quarterly inspections at 2 hours each, 4 times per year at my engineering rate. Semi-annual debris clearing, estimated at 8 hours per session. Annual vegetation management, approximately 16 hours of work. Over a 12-month period, accounting for all materials, equipment, and labor, the total came to $14,200. I itemized every single expense, included explanatory notes citing the county standards and the original development plan, and added a professional header with my name and engineering credentials. At the bottom, I included payment terms, net 30 days, with a 5% late fee per month for overdue balances. The cover letter was simple and professional. Dear Ms. Drummond and Riverside Meadows HOA Board, per your request that I maintain the drainage ditches located on HOA common property behind my residence, please find attached my invoice for said services. As a licensed civil engineer, I am qualified to perform this work to county standards. Payment is due within 30 days of receipt. Should you prefer to maintain these ditches using HOA staff or contractors as originally intended, please notify me in writing within 10 days. Sincerely, Marcus Webb, P.E. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, just like my previous letter. Then I waited. The explosion came faster than I expected. 2 days after Patricia received the invoice, I got a voicemail from her that was so angry I could practically see the spittle flying from her mouth as she recorded it. Mr. Webb, this is absolutely ridiculous. You cannot bill the HOA for work you haven't even done. This is extortion, and I'm reporting you to the County Bar Association and every other regulatory agency I can find. You will be hearing from our attorney. This is harassment, and it will not be tolerated. I listened to the message twice, smiling a bit more each time. Then I called my own attorney. Jeff Ramirez had been a friend since college. We had both gone to Iowa State, though he had gone into law while I had stuck with engineering. He now ran a small practice in Cedar Rapids that specialized in property law and HOA disputes. When I told him what was happening, he laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Marcus, this is beautiful. Please tell me you documented everything. Every single piece. I've got the plat maps, the development agreements, the covenants, copies of all their letters, photos of the actual ditches, and my itemized invoice. And they explicitly demanded that you maintain these ditches? In writing. Twice. With threats of fines and legal action. Jeff laughed again. Okay, here's what's going to happen. They're going to bluster and threaten, but they won't actually file anything because they know they'll lose. What you've done is call their bluff in the most spectacular way possible. Keep documenting everything. If they fine you, don't pay it. If they put a lien on your property, we'll fight it and probably win damages for malicious prosecution. In the meantime, I'm going to send them a letter on your behalf. Saying what? Explaining that their demands that you maintain common property constitute a material breach of the HOA covenants, that any fines assessed will be challenged, and that if they continue to harass you, we'll be filing a complaint with the state and possibly pursuing damages. I'll also request a full accounting of how the HOA dues have been spent for the past 3 years. They're going to love that. They're going to hate it, which is the point. HOA boards like this one get away with their behavior because most homeowners don't push back. You're pushing back, and you're doing it correctly. Let me handle it from here. Jeff's letter went out the next day. I received a copy by email, and it was perfect. Professional, firm, and utterly unambiguous about the law and my rights. It concluded with a request for the financial records and a demand that the HOA cease all harassment and threats within 5 business days. That weekend, I decided to attend the monthly HOA board meeting. These were technically open to all homeowners, though attendance was usually just the board members and maybe 1 or 2 residents with specific complaints. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that mostly served as a venue for the occasional birthday party or baby shower. I arrived 15 minutes early and took a seat in the back row of folding chairs. Patricia was already there, along with the other 4 board members, Dale Henderson, the vice president and a retired insurance agent, Monica Wu, the treasurer and a tax accountant, Tim Bradshaw, the secretary and a high school teacher, and Karen Whitfield, a member-at-large who worked in pharmaceutical sales and had the same energy as Patricia, but slightly less power to act on it. Yes, there were actually 2 Karens on the board if you counted Patricia's behavior, but Karen Whitfield had the actual name to match the stereotype. She was 47, had the same speak-to-the-manager haircut as Patricia, and drove a silver Mercedes that she had once reported someone for parking too close to at a neighborhood barbecue. As other homeowners trickled in, I noticed there were more people than usual. Word had apparently spread about the drainage ditch dispute, and people were curious. By the time Patricia called the meeting to order at 7 p.m., there were about 25 people in attendance. Patricia started with the usual procedural items: approval of the previous meeting's minutes, financial report from Monica, update on some landscaping projects. Then she got to what she clearly considered the main event. Before we move to new business, I want to address a situation involving a homeowner who has been actively obstructing HOA operations and engaging in what I consider to be harassing behavior. She didn't name me, but everyone turned to look at me anyway. We have a responsibility to maintain community standards, Patricia continued. That includes ensuring that common areas are properly maintained. When we ask homeowners to assist with maintenance of areas adjacent to their properties, we expect cooperation, not hostility. I raised my hand. Patricia pretended not to see me. Some homeowners seem to think that paying dues means they can ignore all personal responsibility for the community. That's not how this works. We all need to pitch in. I kept my hand up. Finally, Dale nudged Patricia and pointed at me. Yes, Mr. Webb? Patricia said, her voice dripping with disdain. I stood up. I'd like to clarify a few things for everyone here. First, the HOA didn't ask me to assist with maintenance. You demanded that I personally maintain drainage ditches that are not on my property and threatened me with fines if I refused. Second, those ditches are explicitly designated as common property in the plat map and the covenants. Third, we paid dues specifically for the HOA to maintain common property. I'm happy to share all of my documentation with anyone who's interested. A murmur went through the room. A man I didn't know well, Steve something, raised his hand. I got the same letter, Steve said. I've got ditches behind my house too, and Patricia sent me a letter saying I had to maintain them. So did I, said a woman named Jennifer from across the room. Patricia's face was getting red. Those letters were sent to homeowners who have been neglecting their responsibilities. What responsibilities? I asked. Please cite the specific covenant that makes drainage ditches on common property the responsibility of individual homeowners. Patricia shuffled through some papers. It's in Section 12, subsection 4, regarding property maintenance. No, it's not. Section 12, subsection 4 requires homeowners to maintain their lawns and structures. Section 18 specifically states that common areas, including drainage systems, are HOA property and HOA responsibility. I have copies of the covenants here if anyone wants to verify. I held up the document I had brought. Several people immediately said yes, and I started passing out copies I had made. Monica, the treasurer, was reading her copy with a frown. Marcus is right. This is pretty clear. Common property is our responsibility. Patricia shot her a look that could have melted steel. The board voted on this approach. We don't have unlimited funds. Actually, I said, that brings up another question. We collect about $190,000 a year in dues. The financial report Monica just gave showed only $35,000 in common area maintenance expenses last year. Where is the rest of the money going? The room went completely silent. Monica looked uncomfortable. Dale was studying his shoes. Karen Whitfield looked confused, which suggested she might not have been in on whatever was happening with the finances. "That's not an appropriate question for open session," Patricia snapped. "Actually, Iowa HOA law requires that financial records be available to homeowners upon request," I countered. "My attorney has already requested a full accounting." "Your attorney?" Patricia's voice went up an octave. "You're suing the HOA?" "No, but I'm protecting my rights after you threatened to fine me and put a lien on my property for refusing to maintain property that isn't mine. And speaking of that, I'm still waiting for payment on my invoice." "What invoice?" Dale asked. "The $14,000 invoice I sent for the work Patricia demanded I perform on the drainage ditches. Since she insisted I maintain them, I provided a professional quote for doing so according to county standards." Several people laughed. Patricia looked like she might actually explode. "That is not a legitimate invoice," she hissed. "It's as legitimate as your demand that I do the work. If you want me to maintain HOA property, I'm happy to do so at my professional rate. If you prefer to use HOA funds to maintain HOA property as originally intended, that works too. But you can't demand I do it for free." Karen Whitfield raised her hand timidly. "Patricia, did we actually vote to make homeowners maintain the ditches? I don't remember that." "It was an executive decision based on budget constraints," Patricia said. "You can't make executive decisions that contradict the covenants," Tim Bradshaw, the secretary, said quietly. He had been silent until now, but he was looking at his copy of the covenants with concern. This could expose the HOA to liability. The meeting deteriorated from there. Homeowners started asking questions about the budget, about who had authorized the letters, about what other executive decisions Patricia had made. Monica reluctantly admitted that she had advised against the drainage ditch letters but had been overruled. Dale tried to defend Patricia but couldn't articulate a legal basis for the demands. Karen Whitfield seemed genuinely shocked to learn what had been done in the board's name. Finally, Steve, the other homeowner who had received a letter, made a motion to immediately rescind all demands related to homeowners maintaining common property drainage ditches. Jennifer seconded it. Patricia tried to rule the motion out of order, but Tim, who actually knew Robert's rules of order from his teaching job, pointed out that any homeowner could make a motion at an open meeting. The vote was called, and it passed with only Patricia and Dale voting against it. I went home that night feeling vindicated, but knowing this wasn't over. Patricia struck me as the type who would rather burn everything down than admit she was wrong. I was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more letters from Patricia, each more unhinged than the last. The first claimed that my actions at the board meeting constituted disruption of HOA operations and that I was being fined $500. The second informed me that my unauthorized distribution of HOA covenant documents was a privacy violation and that I was being fined another $500. The third stated that my car, which I sometimes parked in my driveway instead of my garage, was in violation of parking rules and I was being fined $250. None of these violations were real. Jeff sent a response to each letter, professionally explaining why the fines were baseless and would not be paid. He also escalated the request for financial records to a formal demand under Iowa Code Chapter 499B, which governs homeowner associations in Iowa. The financial records, when they finally arrived, were revealing. Over the past 3 years, the HOA had collected approximately $570,000 in dues. Of that, only $95,000 had been spent on actual common area maintenance. Another $80,000 had gone to legitimate administrative costs like insurance and management company fees. That left approximately $395,000 unaccounted for. Monica, the treasurer, had signed off on all the financial statements, but detailed review showed that most of the missing money had been approved in vague line items like community improvement initiatives and special projects. When Jeff subpoenaed the actual invoices and receipts backing up those expenses, the truth came out. Patricia had been using HOA funds as her personal slush fund. She had charged $75,000 in community research expenses that turned out to be trips to HOA conferences in Florida, California, and Hawaii, all of which she had attended alone and extended into personal vacations. She had approved $42,000 for legal consulting that had actually gone to her daughter's law school tuition payments, funneled through a shell company. She had spent $38,000 on office equipment that was actually furniture and electronics for her home office. The list went on and on. Dale had known about most of it and had received kickbacks for his approval votes. Monica had suspected, but hadn't pushed back, because Patricia had threatened to have her removed from the board. Tim and Karen genuinely hadn't known, having trusted Patricia and Dale to handle the finances. When this all came to light, about 6 weeks after I'd first received the drainage ditch letter, the entire board except Patricia and Dale voted to remove them from their positions and file a complaint with the Iowa Attorney General's office. Several homeowners, led by Steve and Jennifer, also filed a civil lawsuit seeking return of the misappropriated funds. The real bombshell came when the Attorney General's office investigation revealed that Patricia hadn't just misappropriated HOA funds. She had also been filing fraudulent expense reports with the management company, claiming reimbursements for expenses she had already paid for with HOA money. That crossed the line from civil misappropriation to criminal fraud. On a cold morning in late November, about 4 months after the first drainage ditch letter, 2 Cedar Rapids police detectives showed up at Patricia's house with a warrant for her arrest. She was charged with 12 counts of fraud, 8 counts of theft by deception, and 6 counts of embezzlement. Dale was charged as an accomplice on several counts. The neighborhood watched from windows and doorways as Patricia was led out of her house in handcuffs, loaded into the back of a police cruiser, and driven away. Her Lexus, which was apparently leased using HOA funds that she'd claimed were for vehicle maintenance, was repossessed 2 days later. The legal proceedings took the better part of a year. Patricia eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Dale and agreement to pay full restitution. She was sentenced to 18 months in the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville, followed by 3 years of probation. Dale got a year in the county jail and 5 years of probation. Both were ordered to repay the misappropriated funds, which totaled just over $400,000 once all the fraudulent expenses were tallied. The HOA had to take out a loan to cover operational expenses while the restitution was being sorted out through the criminal courts and the civil lawsuit. A special assessment was levied on all homeowners to cover the shortfall, which made everyone furious, but at least the new board was transparent about exactly why the money was needed and where it was going. As for the drainage ditches, the new board hired a professional landscaping company to bring them up to county standards. The work cost about $18,000, which was actually more than my invoice had estimated, a fact that several board members mentioned to me with wry smiles. My $14,000 invoice, of course, was never paid. I didn't actually expect it to be. The point had never been to get paid. The point had been to illustrate the absurdity of Patricia's demands and to force the issue into the open where it couldn't be ignored. But the story didn't end with Patricia's sentencing. The ripple effects of her fraud continued for years. The HOA had to amend its bylaws to include much stricter financial oversight, including mandatory annual audits by an independent CPA and quarterly financial reports to all homeowners. Board members were now required to take training on fiduciary responsibility and Iowa HOA law. Expense reimbursements over $100 required approval from 2 board members instead of just the president. Several other homeowners came forward with stories of Patricia's abuses that they had been too intimidated to report before. She'd threatened people with bogus fines for minor violations, used her position to try to control neighborhood social events, and had even attempted to ban certain political yard signs that she disagreed with, which was flatly illegal under both Iowa law and the First Amendment. The management company that had overseen the HOA during Patricia's reign was also fired. While they hadn't been directly complicit in the fraud, they had failed in their oversight duties by not questioning the vague expense categories and by not insisting on proper documentation for reimbursements. The new management company the board hired was significantly more rigorous and actually earned their fees by providing real oversight and guidance. For my part, I became something of a reluctant neighborhood celebrity. People would stop me on walks and thank me for standing up to Patricia. Several homeowners told me they had suspected financial irregularities, but hadn't known how to challenge them or had been afraid of retaliation. Steve started a neighborhood watch group, not for crime, but for HOA accountability, with the stated mission of making sure no future board could abuse their authority the way Patricia had. The civil lawsuit eventually settled for $320,000, which was the amount the plaintiffs could actually prove had been misappropriated. Patricia's house had to be sold to pay her share of the settlement, and she and her husband divorced during her incarceration, with him claiming he had known nothing about her financial crimes. Dale liquidated his retirement accounts to pay his portion. I attended Patricia's sentencing hearing not out of vindictiveness, but because I wanted to see justice completed. She gave a tearful statement about how stress and the demands of the HOA presidency had led her to make poor decisions. The judge was unmoved, pointing out that her actions had been deliberate, systematic, and had spanned multiple years. He noted that she had betrayed the trust of her neighbors and abused a position of authority for personal gain. People elect HOA board members in good faith, the judge said, trusting them to manage community resources responsibly. You violated that trust repeatedly and extensively. This wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was calculated theft from your own community. After Patricia was taken away to begin her sentence, I spoke briefly with the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Angela Chen, who had built the case against Patricia. This was a good catch on your part, she told me. Most HOA fraud never gets reported because people don't realize it's happening or they think it's not a big enough deal to pursue. I just wanted to maintain my property lines, I said with a slight smile. Well, by refusing to maintain property that wasn't yours, you ended up uncovering a pretty significant fraud scheme. The Attorney General's office is actually using this case as an example in guidance we're putting together for HOA boards across the state. That was gratifying in a way I hadn't expected. The whole situation had started with such a petty, absurd demand, Patricia trying to shift a basic maintenance responsibility onto homeowners to hide the fact that she had been looting the budget. My refusal to go along with it, backed up by research and documentation, had pulled on a thread that unraveled everything. The drainage ditches, properly maintained now, flowed smoothly through heavy rains. The neighborhood detention pond, which had also been neglected during Patricia's tenure, was cleaned out and reinforced. The common areas actually looked like someone cared about them for the first time in years. The new board, led by Monica as president after a special election, was boring in the best possible way. They maintained the property, paid the bills, and didn't try to expand their authority beyond what the covenants allowed. I did end up joining the board myself about 2 years after the whole drainage ditch incident. Monica asked me to run for an open position, arguing that the community needed people who understood property law and weren't afraid to ask difficult questions. I was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed to serve 1 term. It was mostly uneventful, which was exactly how an HOA should be. During my time on the board, we updated the community covenants to clarify several ambiguous sections that Patricia had exploited, including explicit language about the HOA's responsibility for drainage systems and other infrastructure. We also added provisions allowing homeowners to request independent audits if they suspected financial irregularities, and we established a formal complaint process for challenging fines or board decisions. The most satisfying moment of my board service came when we used reserve funds to finally replace the aging stormwater management system with a modern, more efficient design. I volunteered to oversee the project using my engineering expertise, and I did it for free. Actually for free, because it was the right thing to do for the community. The new system reduced flooding throughout the neighborhood and actually increased property values by ensuring better drainage during heavy storms. Karen Whitfield, the other board member who had been kept in the dark about Patricia's schemes, became one of the most effective advocates for HOA transparency I ever met. She started attending state HOA association meetings and pushing for legislative reforms to prevent the kind of abuses Patricia had committed. Some of her proposals were eventually incorporated into updates to Iowa's HOA statutes, including requirements for annual financial disclosures and limits on expense reimbursements without documentation. As for Dale, he served his sentence and moved out of the neighborhood immediately upon release. Last I heard, he was living in a small apartment in Marion and working at a hardware store. His retirement was gone, his reputation was destroyed, and his marriage had also ended. Patricia's husband had at least been able to claim ignorance, but Dale's wife had known exactly what he was doing and had benefited from some of the kickbacks. She wasn't criminally charged, but was named in the civil suit and had to forfeit her share of their assets to the settlement. The management company that had failed in its oversight duties was eventually sued by several other HOAs for similar negligence and went out of business. The new company we hired, Midwest Community Management, treated the job like the professional responsibility it was supposed to be. Their contract manager, a detail-oriented woman named Sarah, attended every board meeting, reviewed every expense in detail, and pushed back when something didn't make sense. She would have caught Patricia's fraud in about 30 seconds. I kept my invoice framed in my home office as a reminder of the whole bizarre situation. $14,200 for drainage ditch maintenance, itemized with professional precision, sent in response to one of the most absurd demands I had ever received. Friends who visited and saw it always asked about the story, and I was always happy to tell it. The story also made the rounds in civil engineering circles. Jeff mentioned it at a property law conference, and it ended up being written up in a journal article about HOA disputes and property rights. I was quoted extensively, and the article used the case as an example of how to effectively challenge HOA overreach using documentation and knowledge of the actual rules, rather than just getting angry. I gave a few talks at local real estate offices and home buyer seminars about HOA due diligence, using my experience as a cautionary tale. The key points I always emphasized were simple. Read the covenants before you buy. Understand what the HOA is responsible for versus what you're responsible for. Attend board meetings even when everything seems fine, and review the financial reports. If something seems off, ask questions. If you don't get good answers, dig deeper. Several times over the years, people from other neighborhoods reached out to me for advice on their own HOA disputes. I helped where I could, usually by pointing them toward the relevant sections of their covenants and suggesting they consult with a property attorney. A few of those cases also uncovered financial irregularities, though none as extensive as Patricia's scheme. The Riverside Meadows neighborhood eventually recovered its reputation and its finances. Property values, which had taken a hit during the scandal, rebounded as the new board demonstrated competent management. The community even won a local award for stormwater management after our updated system was highlighted by the county as a model for other developments. I sold my house on Willow Creek Drive about 5 years after the drainage ditch incident. I'd gotten married, my wife Sarah and I had a baby on the way, and we needed more space. We moved to a neighborhood in nearby Marion that, ironically, had no HOA at all, just a voluntary neighborhood association that organized an annual picnic and a holiday lights contest. It was perfect. At the closing on my old house, the buyers asked about the neighborhood and the HOA. I was honest with them about the history, but I also explained how the community had recovered and reformed. They appreciated the transparency, and they also appreciated that the current HOA board was functional and responsible. The drainage ditches, I noted, were in excellent condition. On my last day in the house, before the movers arrived, I took a walk around the neighborhood. I went past Patricia's old house, now owned by a young family with 2 kids who had no idea about its history. I walked along the greenway path that ran parallel to Willow Creek, and I stood for a moment at the back edge of my property, looking at the drainage ditches that had started everything. They were clean, clear, and flowing properly. The vegetation was managed, the banks were stable, and the water moved smoothly toward the detention pond. They looked exactly like professionally maintained common property should look, maintained by the HOA using HOA funds, just like the covenants had always required. I thought about how a simple property line dispute had cascaded into criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and major reforms. I thought about how Patricia's petty attempt to avoid spending money on legitimate maintenance had ended up costing her everything. I thought about how standing up for a basic principle, backed by documentation and the actual rules, had made a real difference. The whole experience had taught me several valuable lessons. First, that HOAs are only as good as the people running them, and that constant vigilance is the price of good governance at every level, even the most local. Second, the documentation and knowledge of the actual rules are your best defense against abuse of authority. Third, that sometimes the most absurd demands deserve the most creative responses. And fourth, that there is something deeply satisfying about responding to a baseless demand with an invoice for $14,000. I never did get paid for that invoice, but in every way that mattered, justice was served. Patricia lost her freedom, her money, and her reputation. Dale faced similar consequences. The HOA was reformed and strengthened, the drainage ditches were properly maintained, and I got to keep my property, my principles, and my sense of humor. As I locked the door of my old house for the last time and handed the keys to the real estate agent, I felt good about how things had turned out. The neighborhood was better off than when I had moved in. The systems were working the way they were supposed to, and future homeowners would benefit from the reforms that had come from one man's refusal to maintain property that wasn't his. Sarah and I drove away from Willow Creek Drive that afternoon, heading to our new house and our new chapter. Behind us, the drainage ditches flowed clean and clear, maintained by the HOA, funded by dues, exactly as the covenants required. It had been a long, strange journey from that first absurd letter to this moment of closure. But I wouldn't change any of it. Well, maybe I would have preferred to uncover the fraud without having to attend quite so many contentious board meetings. But overall, the outcome was about as good as anyone could have hoped for. The last I heard about Patricia, she had been released after serving her sentence and had moved to a different state to live with relatives. She was prohibited from serving on any HOA board as part of her probation terms, which seemed like an appropriate punishment in itself. The community she had tried to control and had ultimately defrauded had moved on without her, stronger and more resilient. Dale had faded into obscurity, working his hardware store job and living quietly. The civil judgment against him would follow him for years, garnishing his wages and ensuring he never rebuilt the comfortable retirement he had sacrificed for his partnership with Patricia. Monica continued as HOA president for several years, providing the steady, honest leadership the community needed. She never let anyone forget the lessons of Patricia's tenure, and she insisted on transparency and accountability in every decision. Under her leadership, Riverside Meadows became known as one of the best-managed HOAs in Cedar Rapids. As for me, I went back to my regular life as a civil engineer, though with a much deeper appreciation for the importance of property rights, clear contracts, and good governance. I told the drainage ditch story at parties, at professional conferences, and to anyone buying a house in an HOA community. It became my go-to example of why details matter and why you should never be afraid to stand up for your rights when you know you're correct. Years later, I would sometimes drive past the old neighborhood just to see how it was doing. The entrance landscaping was always immaculate. The common areas were well maintained. The drainage ditches, visible from certain streets, continued to flow properly through every season. It looked like a well-run community, which it finally was. And somewhere in a box in my new house's basement, along with old tax returns and closing documents, was a framed invoice for $14,200. A monument to absurdity, a trophy of principled resistance, and a reminder that sometimes the best way to fight an unreasonable demand is to take it absolutely seriously and respond with precision and professionalism. Patricia had demanded I maintain those drainage ditches. I had responded with exactly what that would cost. She had expected me to back down, to comply, to just do the work for free to avoid conflict. Instead, I had called her bluff, exposed her scheme, and helped bring justice to a community that had been quietly exploited for years. That invoice never got paid in dollars, but it paid dividends in justice, reform, and the satisfaction of knowing that one person standing up for what's right can make a real difference. Even if it starts with something as mundane as a drainage ditch and an HOA president who thought she could shift responsibility to hide her crimes. In the end, the drainage ditches got maintained, the HOA got reformed, Patricia got arrested, and I got to move on with my life having made my little corner of Iowa a bit better. Not a bad outcome for refusing to do work that was never my responsibility in the first place.